This is a chat with OpenUK CEO Amanda Brock, who has built one of open source's most impactful organisations. As the executive producer of State of OpenCon, Amanda is a globally sought-after keynote speaker. A lawyer with 25 years' experience, she's been instrumental in shaping open source's legal frameworks, as she was internet law during the early 2000s. Amanda regularly contributes to discussions in tech, and she edited Open Source Law, Policy and Practice, 2nd edition, published in 2022. She's been recognised by awards including Computer Weekly 50 Most Influential Women in UK Tech, Computing IT Leaders 100, and Women Who Will. Amanda is on various advisory board roles, including the UK Cabinet Office Open Standards Board and UKRI Digital Research Infrastructure. In this conversation, we explore climate change, open source governance, neurodiversity, and lots more. Enjoy!
So you've spoken at COP summits before, and I think last year you announced the Green Digital Declaration.
Yeah, I did. I got to say that was quite an experience, actually. So one of the things about life is the more that you do, the more you get to do. And I was sitting in that Green Digital Declaration announcement between the country of Japan and a very influential American who were also part of the announcement. So it was quite an experience.
Yeah. And can you give us any hints as to what might come in this year's COP? Are you planning to expand on that or get other countries to sign on?
Yeah, well, we're very exciting for our State of OpenCon, which you've already alluded to I know there's 11 sleeps, so about 11 or 12 days time. We have a gentleman called Thomas Lamanauskas, who is the Deputy Secretary General of the International Telecoms Union, the ITU, who is the person who I think is really, he and the Secretary General are the instigators of the Green Digital Day at COP. And this year was the first time they've had it the way they did this year. And it was the first Green Digital Declaration, which somebody has to have a lot of energy to make things happen. And they were the people with a lot of energy making it happen. And I'm quite excited because the closing keynote in our plenary session on the 4th will be by Thomas. And I'm very hopeful that he's going to be telling us a bit about what's going to happen at COP30 this year, which is in Brazil. And of course, if you know open source and anything about open source in the international landscape, Brazil is one of the countries for open source. So I'm really hopeful that we're going to hear something interesting from Thomas.
Yeah. And obviously the environment is quite a big deal, especially with the rise of compute and AI. And everyone now wants to run their own data center and they want to build more data centers. But of course, this is going to take up a lot of energy. And have you seen the news where Microsoft wants to revive one of the one of the nuclear power plants in Pennsylvania just to power their own data centers? Yeah, what do you think about that? Is that good? Is that a symptom of the bad things that are happening?
Yeah.
Or is that something that more companies should be doing?
Funnily enough, I you may also know this, I did a very short talk, which I will make into a longer talk about my nephew. And I did it at COP29. And my nephew joined us at COP26. He's based in Scotland. And he was with another little girl, the opening speakers for our first Open Technology for Sustainability Day, which was quite a large fringe event. I think he was 8 and was in front of an audience of a couple of hundred people.
Wow.
So quite a big deal. I don't know if I could have done that at that age. And he's very adamant, or he was, particularly when he was younger, big fan of David Attenborough and very adamant about the environment. And then a year or so later, got very into gaming, absolutely loves gaming, and doesn't understand that gaming and YouTube, or didn't understand that gaming and YouTube have a consequence, because the consequence that most people away from tech don't understand is that your digital reality, your digital life has to be processed. And that means it goes back to a data center. That means it needs that compute, and it means that there's energy, there's a lot of consumption. And then there's outputs as well. So, when you use anything digital, although we might think we're being environmentally friendly, having something on a screen rather than printing it out, we create a consequence on the environment. So you asked me about Microsoft. I think AWS have also done the same. I think there's 2 big techs who are looking at nuclear for their power. And I think every country in the world is now looking at how it is going to build more and more data centers. You see the US, I think there's announcements this week about how opening the US up for this. And we know that the global south is still using not nuclear, but fossil fuel to power data centers. And a lot of people in the global north are actually using these global south data centers as well. So I don't know if I'm more concerned about that or the nuclear. In Britain, we're not big. In the UK, we're not big on nuclear, whereas a country like France is much more sophisticated about it. So we've been brought up with quite an apprehension and a fear, which I don't know whether it's justified or not. I don't know enough about it. But I do know that data centers are a huge problem. And we really have to be taking this one on. I was at the Labour Party conference in September, and OpenUK hosted a data centre event. We've also had one in Parliament. And at the Labour Party conference, there were all these tech events, and we were the only ones doing data centres back in September. Now that shows you, 4 months? In that time, it's become almost the most topical tech subject. But 4 months ago, people weren't thinking about it. Even with the UK recategorizing data centers then as critical national infrastructure. And we don't, when people say, we're going to lose our jobs to AI, we don't actually have the infrastructure we need to enable AI. So you're not going to lose your job in any time soon. It's going to take a bit of time because we need the infrastructure to enable the GPUs, to enable the power to actually get into these data centers. And when we start to talk about nuclear, you also think about green energy. But one of the problems we've got is when we produce energy from things like wind farms, getting that to the right locations is proving hugely problematic. So I think we're going to see not just these giant monolithic data centers being built, we'll see all sorts of different energy being used for them. But I think we're going to see more repurposing of existing unused buildings. And I think we're going to see a lot of open source. I think we're going to see more and more open source software because things like containerization enable us to use less hardware, which means that you reduce the size of the kit inside the data center. And as you reduce that down, you're then able to, with smaller server racks, you're able to use less power and to create less waste. But there's a whole model around opening up software, hardware, data to create better data centers. And we've actually just started work on a project for COP30, which we hope will be part of the Green Digital Day, which even involves traditional architects who are going to try and design a model for us to build edge-based data centers close to the end user, repurposing existing buildings. So watch this space and perhaps have that conversation again in November, December when we've got something positive to show you.
Yeah, that'd be cool.
Moving on, I'd like to ask you a question that's perhaps a bit different. You've been quite outspoken about your ADHD and autism and how that's affected you throughout your career. And
I didn't realize I had.
well, I saw a
We
couple
find
of
everything.
LinkedIn posts.
Yeah, you have. Investigative journalists.
From my observations, and do correct me if I'm wrong, but from my observations, the open source community is perhaps overrepresented by neurodiverse people. And do you have any insight as to why that might be? Because I think it's very interesting.
It's very hard now not to be very outspoken. I've talked about this before. I had no idea I was neurodiverse. I just always thought it was a bit odd. And I joined a company called Canonical in 2008, which is when I started working in open source. And when I joined Canonical, I felt like I'd gone home for the first time in my life. And I was suddenly surrounded, particularly when I was there, probably more than now, I was suddenly surrounded by so many people, many of whom are not diagnosed. So it's up to them to decide whether or not they think they're neurodiverse. But I was clearly surrounded by a neurodiverse majority, and I loved it. And I loved it because I felt like I was accepted for who I was. I didn't have to worry about what I was saying or how I said things. And people that others might have considered dull were really interesting to me because they're super clever. And I think there was a basis in open source, and I don't know whether it's a continuum, where a lot of the people who wanted to do it were super clever, and they were doing things because they were being an alternative to the mainstream. So you had to be able to, there were people who wanted to tackle a challenge. When you hear things like Lindsay's Law and scratching an itch, what they were building was technology that they weren't allowed to do in the daytime. They weren't allowed to do because their managers wouldn't let them do it in their jobs. So they were doing it in their spare time. So you have to be pretty interested in something to go and do what you're actually paid to do at work in your spare time, right? And that tends to mean that you have a very intense interest in a thing, which is a typical neurodiverse pattern of behavior. So, you know, like the dinosaur thing in little kids, software and grown-ups. And I think there's a bit of that takes people, if you think about it, from a day job to doing the day job again in the evenings and at the weekends, and not being able to leave a problem alone and thinking there's a problem, I have to fix it. And of course, when you have a problem, everybody else has got the same problem. So then people coalesce around it. So I suspect that we are, in fact, an industry based on the neurodiverse, and that's probably one of the reasons I like it so much. But I equally would not be surprised if people push back on that statement and don't want to be identified in that way, and that's up to them.
Absolutely. And I think just following up on that, you talked about how, I think Deloitte wrote something about how there's lots of benefits in in people who are neurodiverse. But also they didn't acknowledge the negatives, and it's actually, there's two sides to it. So I want to know if you thought that there would be anything that a company which maybe aren't open source companies and so don't have that many people who are neurodiverse, what can they do to help?
Interesting.
Are
Yeah, I think a lot of it's about tolerance. I have a neurodiverse colleague who said to me the other day that they didn't think a number of people around them liked them. And it's absolutely not the case. But they aren't 100% comfortable in their own skin yet, and they're different from the people that they were talking about. And I think making an environment where people are comfortable. Now, we do a lot that's labeled as EDI, but it's been more focused not on a specific, you know, woman or neurodiverse. We've tried to focus on a sense of belonging and to create an environment where it's all right to be you, which isn't something that happens a lot in the big bad world. And when I commented on that Deloitte piece, it was because, so if I say to you as an individual, I know that I'm very direct, except I know that I'm very direct because other people tell me I'm very direct. I don't think I'm saying something in a particularly direct way, but I've learned that's how other people feel about it. And the more, you know, I've been taught to add niceties around it over many years, but then under pressure, I'll revert to type like everybody does, and I'll be even more direct. So there's a lot of intolerance, particularly of women, when we are like that. It's not a very feminine behavior for people. So they'll often push back quite hard. And it was that kind of failure to accommodate. And it's a failure to accommodate something that's not asked for. So if you ask me, do I need an accommodation for being neurodiverse? I might say that I find it really helpful to have transcripts if it's possible. But I know those can cost a lot of money, you know, or not transcripts, to have it's a transcript, I mean, with the words on the screen at the same time.
Captions?
Like captions.
Thank you, captions. But I won't ask for another accommodation. Yet I really could do with people just being a little bit softer about the fact that I might be direct and I don't mean to offend, or a little bit more understanding about that, you know. And it's caused me a lot of grief over the years that I would my life would have been a lot easier without it, put it that way.
Yeah, I think it's quite amazing how this just community of people in open source can do some things just way better than companies are doing. Like they're just struggling with this every day. And then companies, like you say, Canonical, everyone there has been okay with it for like 10 years.
So one of the things that I like is that they really focus on what you do rather than who you are. So it's the outputs of your life. So whether you are talking about something interesting or creating a great piece of code, if you do that and it's something that they are impressed by or consider to be well done, then you are not going to be judged in any way on who you are. You're going to be judged on your contribution.
Yeah. And I mean, on the topic of like open source and private companies, you know how Meta is currently leading the way in creating this community of AI AI developers in an open source environment, which no other big tech company is currently doing.
Mhm.
And we just want to know, why do you think Meta are doing that? Like, why aren't Meta
Okay,
developing
easy.
internal models?
Very easy. So all companies have an obligation to the shareholders, and listed companies have an obligation to the shareholders to create shareholder value. And Meta is doing this in the same way as Google released Kubernetes as an open source project, because open source creates value. It creates economic value. It allows you to build at a pace an ecosystem and adoption in a way that proprietary code never can do, can't compete with it. That, however, comes at a price. And the price is that when you do open source, particularly if we look at the open source software side first, when you do open source software, what you're doing is you're creating code that anybody can use for any purpose. And that means the license doesn't have any restriction on who can use it or what they can use it for. So if you said, I'm going to give the Waffle Bite podcast a license until it has 200 users, and when it has 200 users, it has to come and get a commercial license from me. That restricts the purpose or who can use it. And that's not open source. Now, that creates friction in the ecosystem. And that friction stops the free flow. And it's the free flow of open source, the ability to be able to use it without having to go back and check, that creates that adoption. If you look at a commercial environment, what that means is that you're actually creating innovation that enables your competitors. So they take your innovation and they can use it for any purpose, so they can go and make money out of it. And if you look at Kubernetes, you can see that Google created it, shared it, went into Cloud Native Foundation, and AWS has made a lot of money out of it. I think AWS is probably the winner in many respects in that battle. So they enabled AWS with their innovation. When you look at AI, what Meta have done technically is not open source. So when you look at the license that Llama is on, it is, and it was described before their launch as open innovation. So it's great because it opens up an LLM. So I'm hugely supportive of it. But it has a number of restrictions in the licensing. And one of those is that when you hit 700 million users, you have to go back to Meta and get a commercial license. So it's not truly open source, but it is open. Now, what that means is that from a Meta perspective, if people go off and build on top of Llama and they are super successful, whoever is most successful is paying Meta on a commercial license. So they can't lose. So open source of itself has huge economic benefits, which is why companies open source. You know, not just that scale of adoption, but also making collaborative innovation and taking contributions, and many eyes making bugs shallow, all those things. But Meta's got a double whammied, and it's slightly naughty in that they are calling it open source, and but it isn't, because they're not paying the price of it, and technically they're open washing. Despite the open washing, what they've done is a really good thing in my view. I just wish they would stop saying it's open source when it's not.
Yeah, quite connected to the point you made earlier about how companies exist to make money and provide value to shareholders. Over the past decade, we've seen a real increase in concentration of power to just a handful of big tech companies like Meta, Microsoft, Google. And obviously, as you said, they're interested in making money, and they, consider open source as something that should be done when it conveniences them. But
when it conveniences them, yeah, they do it a bit more than that. But go on.
Yeah, and they fund a lot of open source
they do.
Projects. But are you concerned about sort of the reliance on these big tech companies? Some describe as an oligarchy of big tech companies with respect to the open source projects they fund. Because if something changes, if they decide that ultimately it doesn't benefit their shareholders to fund these projects, does that concern you? And is there anything that
concern me at all? So I have no concern whatsoever about that, because what we have is the ability to fork, and it's a specific to open source thing where, because the source code is freely available, it means that the human readable side of open source is on an open source license. The human readable side of software rather is on an open source license. Now, historically, forking was the nuclear option. And what forking means is that you take a project and you lift and shift it. And communities have used it for many years to keep the leadership in check. So if the leadership is doing something that the community no longer approves of, wants, or goes in a direction that the community doesn't like, the community can lift and shift and create their own version. And we've seen that. Now, again, if you come to State of OpenCon on the 4th, you're going to see some of the forkers, the organizations that have successfully forked. If you had asked me this question 18 months ago, maybe even a year ago, my answer would have been different. And I would have told you it was a real problem and it could be the end of open source. However, what we've seen in the last year in particular is some very successful forks of Redis, HashiCorp, and others. And we've seen OpenBow, OpenTofu, OpenSearch, and Valky, all of whom are having tables. All 4 will be at State of OpenCon, so their communities will be there. And I like to say you can meet the forkers. But the forking ability is what keeps leadership honest. It was considered the nuclear option because it's a lot of work, right? Moving a whole project and then building an ecosystem and doing that in a short time is difficult. Now, Don Foster from Chaos, who's on the OpenUK board, will be giving some stats on this as part of the plenaries. But what we're seeing is really healthy communities beginning very quickly out of these forks, partly because they're supported by a big foundation. They're all sitting in Linux Foundation, so they have that foundation out of a box approach that allows them to build governance and infrastructure quickly, but also because they have these same big tech companies funding, creating it. And I think it took 8 days to do the Valky fork, which is just unbelievable. You know, it used to take months to do that kind of thing. So there's a piece around that where forking by these big companies of big companies is going to make them keep each other honest. There's a slightly different issue around oligarchs and a few people controlling our digital present. And I think that's very relevant for AI and policy around AI. I wrote a piece a week or 2 ago around nation states and companies and the differences between them. And the difference between a nation state where you have a government whose job it is to look after its citizens and a company whose ultimate goal is shareholder value is a problem, right? Because these big tech companies now control the digital that underlies the services our nation states deliver. And it's really sitting in the hands of a very few, which is problematic and worrying. There's a whole, approach to capitalism that may be right or wrong. Shifts that need to be made societally. We may need a less laissez-faire attitude and more engagement and intervention in the markets from governments. And by that, I'm not for a moment suggesting you break these companies up. That's not the goal. The goal is to find more ways of collaboration. And you say that they use open source when it suits them. Actually, I think open source could offer a lot of the answers, because what you're doing is you are encouraging these companies to share their innovation and to enable others to innovate on it. And what you see is that every tech problem in history or in recent history has been solved by open source. It's very hard to find one that open source hasn't been the solution to. And I think what we want to be doing is looking at them and looking at how do we, here in the UK where we don't have any of them, how do we work better with them? Rather than being aggressive and trying to push them out, how do we engage more? And I think one of the answers to that is definitely going to be open source.
And why is there this attitude of companies not necessarily wanting to really push open source that much? Because, as you say, they have a big problem. Why don't they make it public?
I think a lot of them do. I think you'd be surprised. So when you look at the open source community today, there are people who don't want to be employed by them. There are people who don't want to be employed at all. There are an awful lot of people working all over the world for those companies who are being paid to contribute to open source. And we're actually hoping to launch a pilot soon where we will encourage individuals to start to contribute to open source projects to build their experience in the hope that some of them will get jobs with big tech companies that use those projects. So you could be sitting in Shetland, as some of the open source community are, hello Shetland, and you could be one of the major UK contributors, one of the top UK contributors to open source, working for a big tech. I think there's real potential there. We just have to learn how this shift works best and to ensure that a few people don't control our digital futures or our AI futures.
Yeah, and I guess the issue with that is if you then get people on a project and you maybe have, for example, a contributor who's built up a reputation over time, a good reputation, like we see in the XZ utils a few months ago. What if they suddenly go bad? What if their intention was in fact bad all along? How do we stop that from happening again?
There is some guidance from the Linux Foundation that was produced very quickly for maintainers after that to help them to understand those challenges and to work on this, to work on, your governance. It's a really difficult balance. And there is a level where you've probably read that I'm quite keen that people are able to contribute globally. And that one of the huge things for me about open source is that we don't discriminate in who can use our code, and we shouldn't discriminate on who participates, but we should discriminate on people's behaviors and actions. So we shouldn't discriminate on people because of who they are or where they're from. But if somebody is misbehaving, of course we should discriminate. And I think there's a piece, it's slightly complicated, but there is a piece around the success of open source, which is probably quite unexpected in the last few years. The scale and the pace of adoption, we just couldn't have understood that was coming down the line. And what it means is we now have, the apocryphal chap in, is it Nevada, sitting holding up the whole internet, the little cartoon of the maintainer who's responsible for the whole digital infrastructure. And I think there is a reset going on where we've got to a point in history where we have this scale of adoption. We have the infrastructure, the plumbing and the plumber's tools built out of open source software. And we need to work out what this means for the future. So we need to work out how this is going to be safeguarded and funded. And personally, I don't think that's about commercial models. There are commercial models, and it's great if people want to go build a business and make money. But I think this infrastructure is more important and is more fundamental to society. And it's something that everything in our daily lives, everything that's pumping into those data centers we were talking about, is going to be built on. And I think it is absolutely critical that philanthropic funding and government funding is properly managed into that, not just to cover the cost of innovation, which is what most governments and philanthropists currently cover, but the cost of maintenance. And there's a piece around the kind of work that Tidelift, the company, do, where the same sort of thing is needed in the public sector, where the code that is being used isn't just accepted as it is, and that there is a process of discernment and curation adopted by the user, not just in the public sector, in enterprise too. But I think the public sector needs to be responsible for funding some of that. I think about 20% of the innovation cost is what's required to maintain it from the research that I've read. And I think we need to see a shift where people stop just funding innovation, but fund innovation and maintenance, because we will need a structure that allows a level of compliance. And the complex bit is the question of who is responsible for that, right? Do you have a project that has to make sure it's vetted every contributor and knows everything about them and has to comply with security requirements under the Cyber Resilience Act, blah, 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 because people make some money because they have to eat, or they run a business that's small? And will that be prohibitive to innovation and market entrance if they do? Or do we actually say, okay, somebody has to be liable, somebody has to take this risk in the supply chain, but the point at which it lies is the point of discernment and the user. So the user chooses. So if that's the public sector chooses, and it's up to the public sector to know what it's using and how it's using it. And should that be where the liability sits rather than at the project level? And I tend to think it should be. And then the only way that liability shifts from that user is through the passage of money. So if you want somebody else to be responsible for your usage of technology, then you pay them. You don't just take it for free from the open source community and expect them to be responsible.
Yeah, that makes sense.
It's quite a long-winded way of explaining it. I was
Yeah.
worried I was losing people there, but yeah, that really has to be where it lies if this is going to work.
I think you touched on sort of the complying with regulations and responsibility. Presumably, that must mean that you think that regulation has a role to play in this, and so I just wanted to get your opinions on the EU regulations with AI, but also with the one you mentioned, because I think the EU tends to force the burden of the regulation towards the project or the company making the AI or something like that, as opposed to, as you said, the end users. Do you think, maybe if you could elaborate on why you think so and what we could learn from that?
In open source, what we do is we license our code, and we go back to what we were saying earlier on about anyone can use it for any purpose, right? We have no judgment. We don't have ethical judgment, moral judgment, commercial judgment. We just share. Then we leave it to the lawmakers to make the decisions. So if they're going to put an export control rule on it, if they're going to put a safety rule on it or a security rule on it, that's down to the regulators. We'll lobby them and we'll explain the impact of what they're doing to technology and hope that they listen and understand. I think we're at a stage in history, and it's not that I necessarily want it. No, I've pushed back as hard as I can on some of this. I think we're at a stage in history where we've shifted, and lockdown and COVID actually really accentuated this. And we've shifted to a point where everybody accepts that every business, every individual's life, every public sector is digital. There is no escaping it. And if it's digital, it's defined by software. And if it's defined by software, it's built on open source. There's no way around it, right? That is just where we're at today. It is also inevitable that being the case, governments want someone to be responsible. And it's not that I want us to have legislation. There is going to be legislation. That is an inevitability. So the question is, how do you get the right legislation and how do you ensure it works best? And that's partly the trying to get them to understand the point in the ecosystem or the chain where liability should sit and how that sits well. And I know even in Europe, in the EU, they were trying not to make individual developers and projects liable, but then they were also trying to make it at the point of commercialization. And I think they've just been a bit misguided in the way they've done it. And it ends up impacting innovators and SMEs and individuals, which really I don't think was the intention. And I think there's a piece, even if you look in the UK at the AI copyright consultation that's currently underway, there's a piece where we have to understand that we can't apply the old world to the new. I use this more and more as an explanation, but when I was a lawyer around 2000, I was in a .com and the internet was just really taking off. And we used to write contracts between websites. So if you wanted to link one website to another, we entered into an agreement to do that. Yeah, look at you smiling. You can't imagine. How could you possibly make the internet work with that, right? But that was using the old way of doing things in a new environment. And obviously it didn't last long. And we're at that kind of point again. And I think there is going to be an awful lot of shift. There's going to be an awful lot of shift in how intellectual property, so copyright, patents, things like that work. I don't think licensing models with royalties that we're looking for content providers and creative industries and research, I don't think any of that's going to work in the future. We're building sticking plasters just to get us through the next few years and to save these industries. And I think there's like a strategic seismic shift in how many things are done. But a lot of the answers aren't law. A lot of the answers are going to be technological. And they're going to come from the sort of governance that technology puts in place, that technologists put in place around how they do things. And one of the hopes I have is that we can get the lawmakers, the policymakers, the regulators to understand how technology really works today and how we use tools within the technology itself to create governance. And that's probably going to create the solution to most of the challenges we have. I mean, have you seen the AI Act? If you print it out, it's like that. Only about 8 countries and companies in the world are going to have enough regulatory people working for them to comply with it. It's just a nonsense. It's pointless creating. So you need to create something that's workable if you want people to follow it.
So what types of technology do you think might be able to help? Will like the blockchain help with the fact that it's decentralized and
Blockchain helps certain things, right? So everybody's skeptical about blockchain, and the whole crypto thing right now is going crazy in the US. So who knows? There was a UN project I was very much on the periphery, but helped a bit with, where they built a land registry for Afghanistan using blockchain. Now, something like that, it makes perfect sense, right? So it's a good example. Using blockchain for everything day to day obviously wouldn't make sense. And blockchain has the level of compute that you're putting behind some of this stuff. You've got to think about what you're doing. I think there's lots of, if we look at the governance type tools in things like GitOps, and you start to look into those tools, finding ways of applying those to create control would be a sensible approach rather than writing pages and pages of law. So back in the day, we used to talk about creating derivative works, which is very defined in America and not so much here. And we would talk about whether or not you were static or dynamic linking. And if you dynamically linked something, you created a permanency, whereas if you statically linked, it was something that was just transient and you were able to say wasn't a derivative work. So there's the sort of technical solutions like that I think we'll find more and more of as time goes by.
And who will find them?
Who will find them? People who'll make a lot of money if they want to. Yeah, I think there'll be a lot of smart entrepreneurial people who'll be looking at it. It's a good question, actually. Who I would like to find them would be in the case of the UK DSIT. So we've got a lot of work going on in the public sector. A lady leading the restructure of that, Emily Middleton, will be speaking next week, 2 weeks at State of OpenCon, about the public sector digital structuring. And I would like to think that those kind of organizations, the reframing of government digital services that she's working on, I'd like to think that the people involved in that will be amongst those who find them. But I suspect it will all be a bit random. It usually is.
So back to your point about sort of regulators coming up with pages and pages of regulation, and how maybe we should look to technology as a solution. I think there's a real disconnect between lawmakers trying to because they're obviously very worried given the rate of development, and they always have concerns and things like that. But how can we make it such that these lawmakers are more willing and more able to learn about the new technological innovations? Because maybe with increased understanding comes less regulation and things like that.
I agree with you that with increased understanding there will be less regulation. I think what we can do is we can help to share knowledge with them, and we can try and understand their challenges and support them. We have DSIT, Department of Science, Innovation and Technology's AI team, coming to consult at the conference, and we had them there last year. We regularly, when we do these little sessions in Parliament, take technologists in to speak to politicians, and it just helps to build that understanding. So exposing the public sector and exposing political people, not to the usual suspects, not to the people whose job it is to do policy, but to the real business people. And there's a thing in open source where, for a long, long time, we have been built on people, code, and intellectual property. Yeah, we don't need buildings. We need people, we need code, and we need intellectual property to manage our licensing. Well, we manage our intellectual property through our licensing, rather. And I think that means that we're used to having business people, salespeople. We're used to having technologists and lawyers, engineers and lawyers working very closely together. And that interaction is not one that most of society is used to. And I think it can be very helpful, because we've got lots of people who are used to, we took AI people in together, and we had data scientists, we had people who are, running AI startups, we had lawyers, and the AI office would say, what if we do this? And the technologists would explain, and the lawyers would explain. And I don't think they get exposed to that very often. And I think the level of integration that we have is probably fairly unique in tech, but specifically in open source. So I think we can help them.
So last year I went to the DSIT consultation at SOCON.
Did you? Okay.
Yeah, and it was amazing, because there was me who's a student, there was a journalist, there was an AI researcher, there was someone brand new to tech, everyone had a slightly different want or need, and then you just had this DSIT people listening to everything we wanted. and presumably behind closed doors trying to figure out how they can materialize that.
Funnily enough, in conversations with them afterwards, they said to me, they spoke to 200 people, and they said that they frequently would go back to the notes that they'd taken because they were exposed more to the people who were really dealing with the issues in that event than they often are. So I'm glad you did it. It's good to hear. I think it'll be a smaller consultation this time because there's not something so specific coming out, unless, of course, the AI bill, which is due any time now, comes out in advance.
Yes, thank you for joining us, Amanda, and sharing your insights where you can see so much of the industry and you meet so many amazing people. And is there any final words you'd like to say to maybe someone interested in open source or someone who wants to see what's going to happen, where the world is headed?
I ask everybody to take a look at stateofopencon.com, have a look at the website. If this goes out before the conference, do please join us. If it goes out afterwards, there will be a lot of content that will be very interesting, that's well worth watching. And my, I suppose, advice would be try and work out where the door is, because once you can get yourself through the door, you'll find that people are very welcoming and there's a lot of engagement and a lot you can learn, a lot of help you'll find. It's just working out where to get through to get that.
Awesome. Thank you.
Thank you for taking the time to talk to us. We really appreciate it.
Thanks very much.
Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed the conversation, please like and subscribe to WaffleBite. You can find out more about Amanda, OpenUK and State of OpenCon through the QR code on screen or the links in the description down below. Bye!